Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm very grateful for this push in intervention. Of course, he refers, though, to the Asian variety of the hedgehog, rather than the Western hedgehog, which is the nature of our discussion today. Madam Deputy Speaker, the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. And I am extremely pleased to be here and to have the opportunity to respond to the Honourable Member for Plymouth, Sutton and Devonport, who has introduced this to the House. For the first time, I believe, hedgehogs have been discussed by Parliament since 1566, Madam Deputy Speaker, where hedgehogs were, of course, famously raised in relation to the attribution of a bounty of tuppence for the collection of the hedgehog throughout the United Kingdom. Now, it is extremely important to take on board that the hedgehog has gone through an extraordinary evolution. 1566 seems something that was very recent, but of course the hedgehog was around before 1566. The hedgehog was around before this Parliament. The hedgehog and its ancestor narrowly missed being crushed under the foot of Tyrannosaurus rex. The hedgehog was around long before the human species. 56 million years ago, the hedgehog existed. And indeed it tells us a great deal about British civilization that the Honourable Member should raise the hedgehog in front of us. Because, of course, the hedgehog is a magical creature. The hedgehog is a creature that appears on cylinder seals in Sumeria, bent backwards on the prow of Egyptian ships. The hedgehog is, of course, a famous medicinal task taken by the Romany people for baldness, and it represents a symbol of the resurrection found throughout Christian Europe. And it tells us something about Britain today, that this strange animal, known, of course, in Scotland, in Wales and Ireland, originally in Gaelic as that demonic creature, that horrid creature, the hedgehog, celebrated by Shakespeare. Thorny hedgehog, be not seen, come not near our fairy queen, or of course famously in Richard III, that great moment where Gloucester is referred to as a hedgehog, represents a strange decline in British civilization from a notion of this magical, mystical, terrifying creature to where it is today. And I refer, of course, to my own constituent, the famous cleanliness representative of Penrith and the Border, Mrs. Tiggywinkle. Now, I want to be serious for a moment. The hedgehog is, of course, an important environmental indicator. The hedgehog's habitat, its ability to occupy 30 hectares of land, its particular relationship to the hibernaculum, Madam Deputy Speaker, by which I mean, of course, the hedgehog's ability to go, almost uniquely, in fact, amongst animals in the United Kingdom, into a state of genuine hibernation, goes from 240 heartbeats a minute down to only 2 heartbeats a minute for 6 months a year. And of course, its particular diet, its focus on grubs and beetles, and of course the Street Hedgehog Initiative, which the Honourable Member has brought forward, a reminder that by cutting holes in the bottom of our hedges, we can create again an opportunity for hedgehogs to move. But it is also a bigger lesson, the hedgehog, a bigger lesson for us in our environment. A bigger lesson, firstly, in scientific humility. The hedgehog has, of course, been studied for over 2,000 years. The first reference scientifically to the hedgehog, as the Honourable Member will know, is, of course, with Aristotle. He's picked up again by Isidore of Seville in the 8th century, and again by Buffon in the 18th century, and a reminder of the ways in which we get hedgehogs wrong. Aristotle points out that the hedgehog carries apples on his spine into his nest. Isidore of Seville argues that the hedgehog travels with grapes embedded on his spine. Buffon believes that these things might have been food for the winter. But of course, as we know today, the hedgehog, hibernating as he does, is not a creature that requires to take food into his nest for the winter. Again, our belief in Britain that the 5 teeth of the hedgehog represent the reaction of the sinful man to God, the 5 excuses that the sinful man makes to God, is of course subverted by our understanding that the hedgehog does not have 5 teeth. And finally, The legislation introduced in this House, Madam Deputy Speaker, to my great despair, that legislation introduced in 1566, which led to the bounty of a tuppence on the hedgehog, was of course based on a misunderstanding. The idea that the hedgehog fed on the teats of a recumbent cow in order to feed itself on milk. This led to the death of between 500,000 and 2 million hedgehogs over the period between 1566 and 1800, a subject that John Clare takes forward in a poem in 1805, and which led my own department, the Ministry of Agriculture, in 1908 to issue a formal notice to farmers encouraging them not to believe that hedgehogs take milk from the teats of the recumbent cow, because of course the hedgehog's mouth is too small to be able to perform this function. But before we mock our ancestors, we must understand that this is a lesson for ourselves. These scientific mistakes we made in the past about the hedgehog are mistakes that we too may be mocked for in the future. We barely understand this extraordinary creature. We barely understand, for example, its habit of self-anointing. You will see a hedgehog produce an enormous amount of saliva and throw it over its back. We don't understand why it does it. We don't really understand its habit of etivation, which is to say that the hedgehog, which my honourable friend referred to, the push-to version of the hedgehog, of course hibernates during the summer as well as the winter. We don't understand this concept of etivation. The hedgehog also represents, for those of us that are interested in environmental management, the important subject of conflict in habitats. The habitat that suits the hedgehog, of course, as we hear, is liminal land, it's edge land, it's hedgerow, it's dry land. It isn't an animal that flourishes in many of our nature reserves. It doesn't do well in peatland, it doesn't do well in dense, heavy, native woodland. The things that prey on the hedgehogs are sometimes things that we treasure. The honourable member raised the issue of the badger. Of course.
Thank you, Minister, for giving way. Would the Minister agree with me that the success and survival of our hedgehog populations is a direct reflection on how healthy our environment is and how sustainable our environment is? So it's very important that we look after the environment. So indeed the knock-on effect is that the hedgehog population will be looked after.
Thank you, Honourable Lady, very much. This is a very important point. The hedgehog is a generalist species. Traditionally, we haven't paid much attention to these kinds of generalist species. We've been very, very good at focusing on specialist species, for example, redshank, who require a particular wet habitat. The hedgehog is a more challenging species for us now to take on board because, as I was saying, it is, of course, a good indicator of a particular kind of habitat, hedgerow habitat, not much used for peatland or wetland, but very, very good as an indicator for a hedgerow habitat. But I was just going on to the fact that there are some important environmental questions raised by the hedgehog. One of those is the question of conflict with the badger. The other, of course, is the question raised by the Honourable Member for Plymouth, Sutton and Devonport, which is the question about the hedgehog in the Western Isles, which of course relates to the hedgehog's predation, potentially, of the eggs of the Arctic tern. I give way.
I was just going to raise the issue of the hedgehog in the Western Isles. We have established that hedgehogs are a devolved matter, and my colleague, the Honourable Member for Mahalan and Ayr, isn't with us, but it would be interesting to hear the Minister's comments. I know that Scottish Natural Heritage are doing very careful work to humanely remove hedgehogs from the Hebrides, and it would be interesting to know how the UK Government intends to support that.
Well, this is a really important reminder that things that matter an enormous amount to our civilization, to our society and our hearts, like a hedgehog, have to be in the right place. And of course, hedgehogs in New Zealand are an extremely dangerous invasive species that have to be removed for the same reasons in Scotland that people are having to think about the control of the hedgehogs. Doesn't matter whether you're talking about a badger, talking about a hedgehog, or an Arctic tern, the question is, what place should it occupy? But finally, and I think perhaps more positively, what the hedgehog really represents for us is an incredible symbol of citizen science. The energy which the Honourable Member has brought to this debate is a great example of British or perhaps even English eccentricity. And it is on the basis of Gilbert White, the great naturalist in the late 18th century, was himself an immense eccentric. And it is, in fact, eccentrics such as the Honourable Member, and perhaps most famously of all, Hugh Warwick, who's the great inspiration of the British Hedgehog Preservation Society, a man who's written, I believe, no less than 3 books on the hedgehog, a man who represents somebody who talks in very moving terms about staring into the eyes of the hedgehog, getting a sense of the wildness of the hedgehog from its gaze, reminds us that these enthusiasts not only connect the public to nature, sustain our 25-year environment program, but actually contribute enormously, Madam Deputy Speaker, to our scientific understanding of these animals. This is true in relation to bees, this is true in relation to beavers, it's true in particular in relation to Hugh Warwick's work on the hedgehog, and I'm very pleased that we raised the National Hedgehog Day in an intervention. In the end, ultimately, however, we need to understand that the hedgehog is a very prickly issue. And the reason why it is a very prickly issue is that the Honourable Member has raised the question of the hedgehog as a national symbol. And it's on this that I want to end. Some of you will remember that in 1992, the hedgehog was used by Saatchi & Saatchi as an advertising campaign for the Conservative Party in that election, and therefore we should pay tribute to the hedgehog's direct contribution to that election victory. But I would like to challenge the Honourable Member's assertion that the hedgehog should become our national symbol. I ask you, Madam Deputy Speaker, I ask both sides of this House, because this is not a question that concerns only one party, but all of us, do we want to have, as our national symbol, an animal which, when confronted with danger, rolls over into a little ball and puts its spikes up? Do we want to have, as our national symbol, an animal that sleeps for 6 months of the year? Or would we rather return to the animal that is already our national symbol? I refer, of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, to the lion. Majestic, courageous, proud. And if I can finish with a little testimony to the Honourable Member and to those innocent creatures which are hedgehogs, perhaps I can reach back not to their symbol for our nation, but their symbol of innocence, to Thomas Hardy. He says, when the hedgehog travels furtively over the lawn, one may say he strove that such innocent creatures should come to no harm, but he could do little for them, and now he is gone. If when hearing that I have stilled at last, they stand at the door watching the full-starred heavens that winter sees, will this thought rise on those who will meet my face no more? He was one who had an eye for such mysteries.
The question, no, I was encouraging some more positive noises for the minister, who has just made one of the best speeches I have ever heard in this House.